Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Community Outreach Committee of the Ammonoosuc Conservation Trust, I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's program with wildlife biologist Heidi Holman. Ms. Holman is one of just 12 individuals working in the non-game and endangered wildlife program of the New Hampshire Fish and Game Department. Among other work, she is now using data and experience gleaned from her recovery efforts on the lovely Carner blue butterfly to focus on the White Mountain Fritillary and the White Mountain Arctic. Both of these rare butterfly species are literally fighting for survival in our own backyard. Because the non-game program does not generate operating funds through the sale of hunting licenses, it must rely on donations to fund its initiatives. One way we can all support their work is through the Conservation License Plate Program. So next time you register your motor vehicle, please consider asking for a moose plate. I would now like to thank you all for attending, and please join me and ACT in welcoming Heidi Holman to the virtual ACT stage.
Thank you for that, Margaret. Wow, you know so much about our program, and that just warms my heart at the start of this conversation. We're so lucky to have partners out there that understand the non-game initiative, and we are happy to do the work that we do, and we appreciate all the support that we can get. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, Gail. Is that good?
Yes, please.
Okay. So I wanted to start with a poem. I've been looking into really good butterfly poems, and if you happen to find any, please send them my way. I feel like we're discussing butterflies a lot these days, and I just appreciate any inspiration. And this one is called The Butterfly from Alice Freeman Palmer. I hold you at last in my hand, exquisite child of the air. Can I ever understand how you grew to be so fair? You came to my linden tree to taste its delicious sweet. I sitting here in the shadow and shine, playing around its feet. Now I hold you fast in my hand, you marvelous butterfly, till you help me to understand the eternal mystery. From that creeping thing in the dust to the shining bliss in the blue, God give me courage to trust I can break my chrysalis too. So with spring in the air, this is a great message. This poem was written by a president of Wellesley College in the 1800s, who went on to marry a man from Harvard. And I'm wondering if she had dinner parties with Samuel Scudder, the famous lepidopterist that named our butterflies in the White Mountains and so many other species. And that's why she was inspired to write this poem, or maybe she just liked beautiful butterflies. But today I want to talk to you about those rare species that are in your neighborhood, the White Mountain Arctic and Fritillary, and then discuss where we're trying to go as the non-game program with the help of people in New Hampshire to identify the other species in our state that maybe are going to be needing more conservation effort in the future, and how we can get ahead of that before they become in a really severe state that requires listing. So the endemic butterflies of the alpine zone, an endemic means that they are restricted to this one and only place. It's the only place in the world. And these two butterflies got there because when the glaciers came down and then retreated, we ended up with this very unique habitat. And it's above 4,500 feet from Madison to Eisenhower. So it's very limited, only about 16 miles of habitat available for them. And really, for the White Mountain Arctic, and I'll explain their habitat differences in more detail, that species is restricted to an even shorter distance of the presidential range. So again, very, very small place for the only presence of these endemic species in the world. And I just want to mention, all of this work that we're doing, it's beyond just the need of our curiosity. We're trying to determine if the species need federal protection. And how we do that is it's a very systematic approach of how are they doing currently? What are their population size? What do they need to live? Every little piece of information that sort of defines what we need to know about that species. And then we look at the future and we project what's the likelihood of these species to continue to persist in perpetuity. So what's interesting is the white mountain butterflies, they live in the national forest. So their land is protected, and normally development and fragmentation and loss of habitat from humans is the primary driver of why a species is at risk. But in this particular case, it's recreation. As you can see, here's a white mountain fritillary that's resting on the trail, and we actually see them in the trail quite often. I don't know if they're looking for minerals in the dirt or on the rocks. So people going off trail or not being conscious of their footing have the ability to impact or trample them. And especially in areas of high use, such as around the summit of Mount Washington, where there's a lot of people that maybe aren't as educated about the sensitivity of the alpine zone. Areas around the huts where people are staying for overnight, multiple hours at a time. And so again, it's not malicious, but just there's more opportunity for impact in those locations. The other really significant threat that we're worried about is climate change. So as we mentioned, the very nature of how this alpine zone came to be had to do with significant climate changes in the past. And so there's been a lot of work by AMC that talks about what to expect, and maybe we won't have trees encroaching upon the top of the summit because they think that the winds, the heavy winds up there are going to maintain its open character and the stunted growth of the Krumholtz. But there's going to be a lot of other niche shifting for the plants that are there. There's going to be changes in precipitation. All of these things can have a direct effect on the butterfly. It could, if the weather changes and the seasons become shorter or longer or hotter or more erratic, the development time of those caterpillars changes. The length of time an adult lives maybe becomes shorter because they're under more stress of significant rain events or heat. There may be a shift in emergence between the caterpillars and the adults and the plants that they depend upon, and just a whole host of factors that we can't truly understand until we look much deeper. So the first species, in case you haven't caught up on our work, we've been doing some research up there since 2017, but we began with the white mountain fritillary. So it's considered a lesser fritillary. That means it's a little smaller than maybe the one you commonly see, the great spangled. And it's dependent on these areas where the snow builds up and lots of moisture collects. So snowbank communities, also areas where there's runoff, these streams, rills, different seeps that occur around some of the lakes, like Lake of the Clouds. And in these areas, there's just a different community of plants because the organic material has been able to build up over time with that moisture available, and more plants grow. There's more biomass and it falls down. So it's just, they're very unique when you see them. The plants that are there just stand out. And there's a lot of nectar plants available, and that's really key for adult butterflies. So the first significant question we had was, what does it eat as a caterpillar? So we knew that it was in these wet areas, but we weren't sure if it was because of the host plant or because the adult butterfly was just being spotted there, nectaring or looking for refugia. And so this is really uncommon. The butterfly was identified by Samuel Scudder in the late 1800s, but for some reason, he just never really honed in on what its host plant was. And part of this is it's the parent butterfly that came from Canada ate lots of plants. And then when it was left behind on various mountain ranges, the species started evolving into different palates and eating all kinds of things. So historically, fritillaries eat violets. They can also eat vacciniums, similar to the blueberries, and willows, some more shrubby species, which offers them more opportunity later in the season to eat as caterpillars, right? Because there's still green leaf material. And then there's these other plants that similar species had been observed, things in the buckwheat family and a rose family. So we went ahead and brought the animals into captivity because it's really hard to find these teeny tiny caterpillars in the wild. And in the upper right corner, you can see a freshly hatched caterpillar next to the leaves of those plants. So those leaves are probably 1/4 of an inch in size. So they're very, very tiny. So to speed up this process, we brought in the butterflies, we collected their eggs, the caterpillars hatched, and then we had to wait over the winter because they don't feed before they overwinter. They actually live in the alpine zone as that really teeny tiny caterpillar for 9 months before they begin their growth and development. It's absolutely fascinating. So we did this for several years to get a good familiarity with the species, and we were able to confirm their host plants. So this was an amazing breakthrough. They do eat violet and they do eat lots of vacciniums and willows, but they tend to prefer plants that are wetland associates. So that really just brings the whole story together. And what that means to us, though, these two things is now we can start to look at, as the climate is changing, what is the risk to their host plant and what is the risk to the existence of the areas, the moisture that collects in things that the host plants need to grow. It is really good that they eat multiple things. And the reason for that is it allows them the ability to adapt as the climate is changing. So the fact that they eat 3 different things, if one of these plants disappears from any location that they live, it doesn't mean that they no longer have the food that they require. They can eat one of these other plants. So that gives them a bit of resiliency, which is very important. So the next thing we had to look at is we had to understand the population. So we've learned various things about the individuals and how many eggs they lay and what's the likelihood that they survive a winter and how long does it take for them to complete their life cycle. You know, all of that was figured out through the rearing for that individual, but we really need to understand what the species as a whole is doing. And that includes looking at all the different little pockets of populations that live on the mountain ranges across that 16 miles. And if you've ever read anything about butterflies or maybe know some about different ecological theory, but they live in what's called a metapopulation. They're patchy in nature anyways. Their host plants aren't usually a big field somewhere. They're like a small garden-sized plot here, and then a couple 100 meters away, there might be another patch. And the proximity of those patches, the size of those patches, and the ability of the animals to move between them is really what determines how healthy a population is and the likelihood of that species persisting. So we wanted to know how isolated were all the butterflies across this 16 miles? Which ones were isolated and which ones might not be? And so on the left, you'll see all those little dots are representative of where butterflies had been observed historically. We just put all the data together that people had given us and other researchers, and then we put a buffer of 100 and 300 meters. And those are the distances that typical butterflies disperse. So, we said, what's the likelihood if they move 100 meters, then how connected are all those pink dots? And you can see there's a lot of space in between them. But if they move 300 meters normally, and they can travel between patches that far apart, how connected is that habitat? So we've done some work on this in two different ways. The first part is we went out and we collected DNA from all of these different circles across the range. So we used this information to segment where we would collect tissue from individual butterflies that would then be analyzed by a really smart person at UNH that will tell us, well, do the butterflies at Madison make it to Jefferson? How? And they can see this because it'll show how related they are. And then they'll be able to tell us, well, how related are the butterflies in Madison to Clay? And this will start to help us understand, again, how healthy the population is. The other method that we used was a mark recapture study. And this was in a very limited spot around the Monroe area because it's very challenging to conduct in these conditions. And we were able to get a very small data set of individuals that we marked, and then about 5 days later, we found them again somewhere else. And we got a dispersal distance of just under 300 meters. So that's really good news. It looks like if that's the case, most of where we see the butterflies have some sort of connectivity. While we do all of this work between captive rearing and we capture the animals to collect a tissue sample for DNA, and we're capturing the animals for the marker capture and releasing them, we're taking measurements on the size of their body. And why this is important is work that was done up in the Arctic of the very closely related butterfly that this species evolved from over time. They showed that as the climate warmed, the butterfly was reducing its body size. And this is very common when butterflies are put under heat stress. It speeds up their development. They tend to acquire less nutrients. They don't eat as much. And so their overall body size, wings, and also their abdomens are much smaller. And so this impacts their ability to grow as many eggs. And it also impacts the ability for them to travel that 300 meters. So over time, we'll periodically take measurements on the species to see if we're observing a size reduction. And that will let us start to know if there is potential that the connectivity of this population is being reduced. The White Mountain Arctic is a very different butterfly from the White Mountain Fritillary in that it lives in the really exposed open grassy areas, specifically around the cone of Mount Washington and then Monticello lawn, Bigelow lawn. They eat the sedge, the Bigelow sedge that's predominant there. So they're very restricted in their habitat. They also overwinter as a caterpillar, and it takes them 2 years to complete their life cycle. There was a lot of work done on the species historically from a PhD student. She showed that the populations were connected, very similar work that we did. She couldn't get a population estimate from her work. And so that's our goal last year and this upcoming year. We finally figured out a protocol that would work. As you can see, It's very hard to detect this butterfly, and a lot of our techniques rely on us standing in a certain location and observing the butterfly so many feet away from us. And it has to be likely that we're going to observe them. So when this species hides behind a rock, especially on a windy day, it doesn't really work for many of the techniques, but we finally found one. In addition, we've been doing similar captive rearing experiments, and we're trying to develop protocols. So if in fact we find out either of these species are declining to the point they need augmentation, we'll have the ability to do it. And as simple as it seems to raise butterflies, a lot of people have handled monarchs. Not all species are the same. And this particular species, we have yet to complete its life cycle in captivity. We've only worked with it for 2 years, and hopefully this year we will be able to get it to complete all of its caterpillar phases, form a chrysalis, and eclose. So it's important that we start this work well in advance before you need it, just to make sure that you have the technique down. And while we do this, we learn so much about the species. We monitor its rate of growth. We document the size of its instars. We learn about, again, the reproductive potential of the adults. So far, our initial estimate for this population was about 1,500 last summer, which is good for a species that has a pretty set life cycle that is stable. 1,500 can persist for a very long time. My work here with the Karner Blue, 1,500 is not enough for a population to persist. And it's because they're very sensitive. They have multiple generations per year. They have different selection pressures. And we estimate they need a population of 6,000 to 9,000 just to keep going year after year. So that's some of the work we'll continue to look into. We know from the captive rearing that there is no way to speed up the development of this species and have it complete its life cycle in 1 year. And that's really important because there's a potential, if some individuals can have their development sped up, that you can have genetic rescue between even and odd years. Otherwise, they're almost two separate populations. They just happen to live in the same place, but they never actually interact or breed. So that means that a population in the odd years could go extinct, but the population in the even years could not. So we'll look into this a little bit more, but this is the type of information we need to share with Fish and Wildlife Service. And we're really uncertain about some of the smaller populations, especially in the Monticello lawn, even though the DNA work from the PhD student had showed that they were very closely related, indicating that they have genetic exchange. They've never been observed traveling between those two distances, and the population is really, really small from what we can tell. And we also have a question if there are any remnants living near the Madison hut. So we're hoping to get over there because we suspect if there were, they are also an incredibly small population as well. So we'll continue this work. We don't have all of the updates and answers yet. We keep plugging away. This year, we'll do some more very specific surveys looking at egg laying in the wild and completing that life cycle in captivity. We're performing some experiments that mimic warm-ups in climate in November and also in spring when snowpack is projected to be non-existent or to disappear earlier. And we're also starting work with some of our partners at the Forest Service and different recreation groups to develop education, different interventions to make sure we address any potential recreation impacts, trampling, And then also discuss the potential of any translocation in the future that might be needed to keep their genetics in good health. And all of this information over the next few years will go through modeling that looks at the population's viability. So those are all the factors on the right of data that we've been collecting. And this should tell us, what is the likelihood of extinction? I do want to add, I don't have any slides, but we've had a master's student, Heather Syart, working with UMass and the Northeast Climate Science Center. And she's doing some really excellent species distribution modeling and looking at the habitat and climate projections to show where some of these different snowbank communities and sedge meadows will be at risk. So that will be really exciting information. And I'm sure she will present that in the future for people to see. So again, when we partake in any of these types of projects, we have to collaborate with many people to get it done. And we just like to represent that. No one works alone in these types of fields, for sure. So Gal, I can pause if anyone has questions at the moment on the White Mountain project.
Thanks, Heidi. We didn't have a question specifically about the research that you're currently doing, more something that is about planting for some of these, potentially some of these butterflies around your home in the North Country. And I don't know if you'll get to that in later part of the presentation, but that did come up while you were speaking.
Okay, so just butterflies in general, or I'm assuming, because the endemic butterflies don't go below 4,500 feet. So they're not going to make a journey to your house. I think it's not enticing enough to them. So
yeah, if you don't mind sharing a couple of things, if you have a couple things off the top of your head, I think that'd be great, just to touch on this question, and then we can keep moving.
So plant native is the big message right now, and people have probably heard or maybe could look into Doug Tallamy. He talks a lot about how native plants relate to our biodiversity of insects. So we have 110 butterflies that are seen somewhat regularly here in New Hampshire. And every single one of them is different. So the White Mountain Fritillary eats those alpine vaccinium blueberry plants and willows and violets. But some of these other species here on this slide, like the middle on the top is an elfin called the pine elfin, and it eats pine trees. So if you just leave a white pine tree next to your house, you're feeding that particular caterpillar. And you may actually see this butterfly. Again, some other species like the skippers down at the bottom left there, they eat just native grasses. So if you have an opportunity to allow blue stem, and if you have a meadow or a field that was once seeded into like a cold season hay crop, but you're not harvesting it anymore, you can just modify your mowing and allow maybe native grasses to come in, and you would start supporting a broad suite of butterflies. Actually, blue stem fields, probably the most that we have are along roads and under power lines. So they're inadvertently contributing to our biodiversity. So every native plant probably feeds some species of butterfly. So when it comes to the adults and attracting them and being able to observe them, that's about the flower and the nectar. So, butterfly weed is a good one. I would not recommend butterfly bush. Butterfly bush has become invasive in some parts of the United States, which means it can start to escape and go into your native habitat. So I would say butterfly weed is native to New Hampshire. It's orange. It's very close to the milkweed family. Milkweeds, of course, are wonderful nectaring plants, and they're going to bring in many of your other pollinators. Lots of color. Butterflies like color and vary that color. And then the other thing is make sure that you have flowers available as long as you can through the season. So try to plant May, June, July, August, September, all different flowering plants. And that's going to make the diversity of butterflies you see greater as well, because some species like the pine elfin only flies in May, and you're never going to see it in August. But something like the lady butterfly on the right, you're more likely to see them, I think, later in the summer and into fall. So asters are an amazing nectar plant, and goldenrod as well.
Fantastic. Thank you. Do you mind spelling Doug's last name just for anybody that's trying to look him up?
Sure, it's Tallamy.
Great. Thank you. And while you were talking, there was another question that popped in from Lynn. Why do the White Mountain Fritillary stay at the top of the mountains? It seems that the plants they eat are at lower elevations.
I'm not sure I'm going to do this justice necessarily, but it's a fact. It's a matter of evolution in the sense that other types of fritillaries, like the Great Spangle Fritillary that you see pretty much from June to September. I think it's like the 5th most common reported butterfly in iNaturalist for New Hampshire right now. It can have multiple generations in a year, and it can fly further, it has bigger wings. So it has the ability to move around. It has more tolerance in all of its life stages. So its caterpillars can stand maybe a greater range of temperatures. The White Mountain Fritillary is just evolved to need that extreme cold for the overwintering. It has a much longer life cycle. It was thought that it was 2 years historically, but we're seeing data that they can do it in 1 year. But that means it's still only 1 generation of butterflies per year, and they're smaller, so they can't migrate as much. There's a lot more at risk for them to leave their habitat. And if their dispersal distance is only 300 meters, they need to find the next patch of habitat. And from what I would think around the White Mountains, the next field is definitely going to be like a mile away when you're going from 4,500 down to 1,000 meters. So there's actually no place for them to sort of travel and colonize and then expand. So I think that that's part of it as well. I think you're on mute.
Thank you. We did get one more through the chat here while you were talking. Are you seeing invasive plants in the mountain butterflies range? What are they, and what are the impacts on the butterflies?
So I don't know of any besides the dandelion that I've seen the Forest Service botanists coming up and picking them along the road, and I've had to ask them questions when I was trying to ID other plants. So that's the only one that I really know about. No one has talked to me from the Forest Service about other plants that are a concern to them. I haven't seen anything that I normally would see at low elevation, like some of the buckthorns or honeysuckle, things like that. Maybe if there was an invasive up there, it would be hard for me to identify because it's so unique to survive in that location. So I don't know of anything else besides the dandelions at this time. Yeah.
Great. That seems to be it for now. So I think it's safe to move on to the next thing.
Great.
Thanks everyone for your great questions so far. Keep them coming.
So, we talk about here at Fish and Game and in our non-game program, we have this thing called the Wildlife Action Plan. And this is the document we write every 10 years. We go out and we ask the public and all of our conservation partners, what do we need to do to protect wildlife and their habitats in the state? What are those that are at greatest risk? What are the ones that need actions that are priorities for our resources? And so it creates this document. And the idea is that we don't want species to get to the point that they are in such small populations or get declining and at risk to extinction. And we've slowly been able to move the needle with that. And our goal eventually is just to keep common species common. And especially with the butterflies that we're talking about, again, there's 100 some odd species. We have such an opportunity to get ahead of that curve as long as we have the information to be able to watch them over time and make decisions in advance of those significant declines. So one thing that we're working on is developing a monitoring network. And what this means is we're just trying to bring everyone into the fold and give them the tools to be able to collect the data on those species to answer those questions. We don't have the capacity to get to every place in New Hampshire and to do it at the right time for every species. And so by engaging individuals all over the state on any given day, we have the opportunity to get the data we need to start determining what needs to be done next. So we launched the network last year. We had some pilot projects with the Harris Center down in the southwest part of the state. This year, we're beginning some work with Tin Mountain in your area. So lots of people are joining in. We're super excited. So when it comes to butterflies too, there's just so many threats because they live everywhere. It may be recreation in the alpine zone. It could be agriculture, plowing up those blue stem fields, changing them into hay fields. Climate change affects all of them. They're insects. They're temperature dependent on every aspect of their life stage. They speed up and slow down depending on the environment around them, and that can cause really big changes in their life cycles. And then, of course, development and fragmentation. We're seeing an unprecedented amount of development, I think, again, in New Hampshire for this decade. So there's quite a few ways that people can participate, and we are thankful for that because not everyone has an entire day to come do something with a group and meet somewhere. We're trying to offer you the opportunity to just, if you're out in your backyard and you happen to see a butterfly, you can record an observation and submit it to us, and that has value. So opportunistic observations, that's just any day of the week. It can be one particular observation. That would be through iNaturalist. And then eButterfly is a platform out of Vermont that if you were so inclined, you could read up on it and learn how to collect a transect data set similar to eBird. We're not really working to train people on that just yet, but I do like to let people know it's out there if they're birders and are familiar with that system. But the other thing that we're really focusing on getting up and running are point counts. And we have 6 locations across the state that will happen in the month of July this year. And they're following a protocol developed by the North American Butterfly Association. So these point counts are very similar to the Christmas bird counts, and they began in the 1990s, and the data is great for all researchers across the country to use because it's standardized for species that live beyond the range of New Hampshire. The other thing we're doing is we're trying to offer trainings, and we've built a big a group of people that are really into butterflies that are willing to help out. I don't know if you've been aware, we've advertised on Nature Groupie, and we're partnering with people like New Hampshire Audubon to do these butterfly ID trainings. The next one is coming up on March 22nd. They're just an hour long, and we're focusing on short groups of species. We have a lot of other trainings that volunteers are putting together. And in the future, we're actually hoping to do some train the trainer trainings. So we want to help empower people to have the skills to teach those in their communities as well. We want to megaphone this out as far and wide as we can. So what we talk about in these trainings, not only do we talk about the host plants, because a lot of people do have that question. How do I welcome these species into my yard? And everyone is different. Do you have a plant list, and who eats that? And so we'll explain like what a particular butterfly eats and when it's likely to be flying, what life stage it overwinters in. We share vocabulary that help describe how to identify markings on the wing, ventral and dorsal views, so when the wings are open or closed, and then things like the outer margin of the hind wing, submargin, fringe, all of that we go over in detail in these trainings. So it's super helpful. Even if you don't make it to a training, again, you can participate if you see a butterfly. And how you do this is all you got to do, sign up for an iNaturalist account. It's very easy. You can look at all kinds of data that other people have collected. In particular, the best way you can participate with us is to click on that community page. There's a drop down that says projects, and you can find the New Hampshire Butterfly Monitoring Network in iNaturalist. This is a project that's designed to sweep up all of the butterfly observations that anyone submits that are located in New Hampshire. It's really powerful. When I made this slide, we had just begun talking about this and getting people to participate. And last year alone, there were about 5,000 observations submitted by New Hampshire residents. So we doubled what was previously recorded in iNaturalist for the first 10 years in 1 year. So we're hoping to maybe double our observations to 10,000 this year. So again, just to explain a little bit about an observation, you are walking in your local park and you see a butterfly. You have your phone with you and you can take a photo of it, and then you can give some basic information to make that a record. So this is what it looks like on your phone. If you were to download the app, you'd observe if you saw a butterfly. Then you'd select, I'm going to take a picture, or if you happen to take the picture when you were out there, you can go back when you're home and choose your photo library to upload it. It's going to give you the information of when the photo was taken, the location of it, if you have that option turned on. So all of that information is immediately populated. Or if you don't want your location to be available by default, you can turn that off, and then you can use the mapping element to put it where you observe the butterfly. So it's really great. You may not know what that butterfly is. There could be a recommendation of what the species is. So that's what I mean. You can participate without being completely educated and learn while you're doing it. So at that point, your observation goes in and other people can comment and they can say, oh, it's actually this species, or they can confirm that it's the species that iNaturalist or you selected. This is an example of if you wanted to see eastern commas in New Hampshire. you can click on the species and it'll give you a list of all the observations. And this gives you information about what time of year, if I wanted to see if people had started to see eastern commas, I would look to see if there was a record yet from 2022 or 23. So it's super helpful to understand what's going on and what other people are seeing. The other view besides the list view is a map view, and basically it gives you the distribution of the species as it's been recorded in iNaturalist to date. And this is just wonderful. This is the data that is going to be very helpful to us into the future of understanding these butterfly species. So again, just to confirm, the date of the observation, the location of it, a photo, those are all the basic information we need for it to have a high quality grade to be used in long-term monitoring of these species. This is an example of the data that we had for the Great Spangled Fritillary. The one that I've mentioned is the 5th most reported butterfly on iNaturalist. So back in 2013, there was a compilation of existing data, and it was all the records from the late 1800s to 2011. It was only 8,500 records for that entire 130 years or something. I mean, we've already done that in 1 year together. And so the distribution was very limited. It was spotty to those towns on the left. And now in the data that's available, we see that its distribution is throughout the whole state. So this is an example of the things that we can accomplish with just the one-off observation by many, many people. So if you're really interested in helping too, we find that data is missing from this early spring and the fall window. And I don't know if people just aren't outside as much, or they're not as observant because they don't think something's going on, or they're not going to see something. I'm not really sure, but we're missing species that only fly during those time windows to get really good information. The other thing that's super important about these windows is that we're going to start to document when species start to fly earlier as an effect of climate change, or if they're flying later into the fall. This will start to help us document, are they having extra generations per year? All really incredible, valuable information as we're tracking how their populations are doing over time in our state. So as I mentioned before, a little more information about the 4th of July butterfly counts and how we're promoting that and asking people to join us. Historically, there was one in New Hampshire, and it's actually the one closest to your region for the most part. It's in the Baker's Pond area. It usually is centered around Warren and Wentworth, those locations. And that one's been going on for about 20 years, but otherwise there's an absence of them in our region. And so again, as of this year, we have 5 additional circles that are formed across the state. The other closest one to you is in Conway with the Tin Mountain team. What makes these powerful, even though they're only 1 day a year, is that they are standardized. So that makes them available for other researchers to use, because we've accounted for all these variables, like the weather was good and the time of day is recorded and the year. And we actually look at effort. So we go to a property together and we mark that it's 12:30, and then we walk around for about 30 minutes and we record every species and how many we see. And then we record the time we finish. And that gives it also some validity for use in research. This is an example of the super sanctuary circle. So with the Harris Center, we started a small butterfly club last year. With the help of a volunteer, we've created modules that we're sharing with people who are interested, and you can get together and learn butterflies as a group. And within these modules we've created to date, you can learn up to 40 species about. So this group met, there was a trainer that volunteered to lead it, and they did one night a month in the winter. And then in May, I met them out there at the Harris Center, and we practice how we would do the 4th of July count. And this is the 15-mile radius circle around their area. So just in this one day, 18 people showed up, which is good because we need to have a minimum of 6 party hours. So again, it's important for all these circles. We have lots of people coming. It doesn't necessarily matter that everyone feels completely confident in their butterfly ID, but we do need a couple people that feel pretty confident, and we organize our teams to accommodate that. We were able to go to 9 conservation parcels that the Harris Center had protected and collect data on butterflies for them. And just in that 9 hours of party time, so it was actually just 3 hours because it was a 90-degree day and we took the afternoon off. We recorded 839 butterflies. That's just amazing to me. 23 species. And again, a lot of these people had never known about butterflies except the monarch prior to joining this club. So I offer, this is our website at Fish and Game, where our web page, where we're currently listing all of the field day events, different trainings that are going on, the dates of the point counts. I'm continuing to update it as partners give me information. I will be including emails for contacts. A lot of the events are going to be registered through Nature Groupie, so I would offer you to just check there periodically. And you know, if you're interested, again, the Baker's Pond count or the Conway count with Kin Mountain would be an excellent opportunity for you, or just submit your observations from your backyard. And that's what I have for tonight, Gal.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Do we have an opportunity for one more question?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, we'll have opportunities for a whole 6 to 10 minutes, depending on how long people want to stick around.
I couldn't seem to figure out how to get it onto chat.
That's okay. No, go ahead.
I
Feel free
was
to turn your camera on as well if you'd like people to see you asking the question, not just hear you asking the question.
Yes, I was very interested in the part of the program about what was taking place primarily on Mount Washington or on the presidential range.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of permission does it take to get to do the kind of intervention where you capture the species of the animal, as you call it, and take it off site? Is it extensive? Is it several people, different groups? Who has to give that kind of permission?
So they're state protected species. So Fish and Game has the authority, and it would require a permit from Fish and Game.
And is there a public hearing, or is there, how do people know that the question is being asked?
But so if an outside researcher was submitting for a permit, no, there's no public hearing. It just gets reviewed by our staff and decided, you know, if basically we're looking at what is the net benefit to the species and the contribution of the potential impact. So when it comes to Fish and Game, I don't permit myself, but I am, I think, trusted as a professional to make the decision along with the conservation partners to do that.
The
That's
day
sort of-
may come when there's a different viewpoint on whether things should be taken off site or how many or who. Do we have a structure that's going to protect the butterflies?
So far the butterflies are removed. We remove about anywhere, we have a permit from the Forest Service too. We work with them. And we take in 10 females and we hold them for about 10 days and then we return them. So they're not removed off site permanently. So if that makes you feel better.
Well, I'm foreseeing 10 years from now when there might be a different, more competition, different viewpoints, some development interests that cause greater concern,
mm,
you
so
know,
I think
change. And I'm thinking of when we were doing they were doing the plants near lakes, and they got permission to take them to Massachusetts and raise them, and then ultimately transplant them. And you know, how did that happen? That was allowed. Maybe some other things aren't. I think it's very important to know that there's sort of a public acceptance of the fact that there is a process and there is a public interest.
so when it comes to plants, the Natural Heritage Bureau has the authority if they are a protected plant. From there, also the White Mountain National Forest would be reviewing any research and proposal and, determining whether or not that activity could occur. And
Right?
I'm
It
not
turned out to be
familiar.
quite successful.
What was that?
It turned out to be very successful.
Oh, good. Yeah, I'm not familiar of a public process like a hearing for any of those. It just,
Maybe somewhere along the line, we ought to think about that. Because
right.
it's going to become more contentious. There'll be different people interested in the results and therefore interested in the process.
I was just trying to think about, so that is the case when I do work with the Karner blue butterfly because it's federally protected. I have a permit and I also have to submit a captive rearing plan to them. And that does go out for a public review for 60 days. So, we tend to mirror our laws as states, similar to the federal process, but they're much slower to evolve. And if you're familiar with the recent changes in our threatened and endangered species laws, that took a very significant act of someone bringing it to the Superior Court. And so I would suggest that that will come from the people, not from us. That's the way it's supposed to be. But we will be here to provide any information that is necessary, if someone were looking to create that process.
You've made it a fascinating presentation. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Edith. We have a couple of other questions from the chat that I just want to make sure we get to. I know we're coming up on time, so if anybody needs to hop off, Heidi, thank you so much. I think we maybe have just a couple more minutes here. One question came in right at the end of our last session. You were talking about dandelions, and somebody asked whether or not butterflies were attracted to dandelions. She was not aware, so I figured I would check in, make sure that that was understood and clarified.
Yeah, I think butterflies and bees and everything are attracted to dandelions. They're the only invasive plant that I know is actively being removed in the alpine zone.
Got it.
They're concerned, of maintaining the integrity because it's such a rare community.
Absolutely. Thank you for that clarification. The other question that came in says from Kathleen here, you mentioned that land development is one of the reasons for depletion of the species. Are there any programs in place that buy tracts of land for conservation or any other programs that put land under permanent protection, presumably for butterfly protection specifically?
Yeah, there's lots of ways to do it. I mean, obviously, partners like the Ammonoosuc Trusts are employed all over the state to help with easements and permanent protection, either, fee ownership. And usually the Wildlife Action Plan, the priority species and our mapping of high quality habitat often feeds into the decision process for who gets funded for what projects. So that's a primary mechanism of how we try to drive conservation for the greatest good of wildlife. Sometimes we have very specific plans, like say for turtles or for the Carner Blue or New England Cottontail, that have focus areas that we can actually direct things in a more finer detail. We need properties in this square mile radius. That's the distance the species lives and travels. And so that can offer a further lens into what to do. The money typically comes from all kinds of pots. Most land protection has several partners involved. It may be a local community that's using the funds from current use that have been changed. It could be grants through LCHIP. It could be the Aquatic Resource Mitigation Fund money. It could be partners. The Natural Resource Conservation Service does agricultural easements, wetlands easements, all kinds of things. Fish and Game sometimes has money, the Nature Conservancy. So really it's just, again, letting everyone know what the priorities are and how high that priority target is, and making sure that we're on the ground where we need to be.
Great, thank you. I had another question pop in while you were talking. What field mowing alteration is recommended to help butterflies, and would it also assist other species?
Absolutely. So if you have the opportunity not to mow your field, that's like number one. You could just maybe mow it once a year, and you could rotate the time of year, right? Because if you always mow in June, whatever species is a caterpillar in June is going to be repeatedly potentially be killed in that process. But if you're altering it in May or October, that can help. The other thing that you can do is you can just do a portion of your field in any given year. And that's really the best thing we recommend. So maybe divide it up into thirds or a half and just mow that one in a given year. So there's always refugia next door. The thirds is better because it gives you 2 years in between to allow the insect populations to re-establish after the disturbance. And if you do mow once a year as well, a lot of times the dormant season, so October might be the best because most of our insects have gone to bed and they're no longer needing those plants to nectar on or feed. So those are some of the options that you could do.
Wonderful. Thank you. And a lovely way to kind of end it on something that folks can do on their home turf. I saw at least one person say they feel inspired to get a conservation plate. So
Excellent.
We got another moose plate on the road. Thank you. Really, really lovely, super interesting. And I do have Heidi's slides, so I'll be sharing those when the recording is ready. So you guys will all get access to that. I popped a couple of things into the chat, but I'll try to also put some names and links and things that Heidi mentioned into our follow-up email as well, just so that you guys have resources to come back to. And thank you, Heidi, again. Really wonderful. It's always a pleasure to have you speak with us, and we're just so thankful that you made some time and for all the work that you're doing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Have a great evening, everyone.
Thank you for joining us.